America region and the president of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. And together we are doing this panel that we will ask each guest or each of the panelists to go over an area, and then we will have questions and answers that followed up. And how we did that was we looked at the previous global agenda and we realized the pillars that it was built on, the 4 pillars. So we decided to look at that and see, as it relates to those 4 pillars, what are some of the areas that we feel are really pertinent for us to address for the 2020 to 2030 agenda. So I'm going to call on each of them in a different order. I'm going to ask Joan to first go over and talk about the guaranteed wage. And then I will have Kathy, who will discuss defunding the police. And then we will have Jan, who will talk about climate change. And then Robin, who will talk about the social determinants of health. And how we did that was promoting social and economic equalities we really felt was pertinent as we looked at a guaranteed wage. And then ensuring the dignity and worth of the person, really kind of outline defund the police. And then promoting sustainable communities and environments. We thought Jan really could address climate change. And then promoting the well-being through sustained human relationships. Obviously, that deals with the social determinants of health. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Joan to get started, and we'll just move through each presentation, and then we'll be open for questions. Once again, it is our honor and privilege to be here and have voices from around the world shape the next global agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitz, so much. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. Originally, we were hoping we would be in Western Canada for this, but that didn't happen. Thank you, COVID-19. However, I'm in the eastern part of Canada, the most eastern point, and I'm in an island in the North Atlantic. So I'm talking today from my house in Outer Cove, Newfoundland. But happy to be with you. So as Mitt mentioned, things did not go exactly as we had planned with the whole panel presentation and the conference. And there's certainly repercussions of the pandemic ongoing. There'll be physical, mental health, and so many more things. I'm referring it now as the times of COVID because I don't see an end in sight at this moment. So we're just going to go with the flow with that. It's given us a lot of challenges, but at the same time, I think it's also giving us an opportunity to reflect on what could we do to change things and what would be better solutions. And as my pillars focusing on social economic and guaranteed income, I thought that would be a really great opportunity to talk about this. As social workers, we know poverty is always present and in many forms. And we know poverty impacts every aspect of our clients' lives, their community. And as social workers, we've all grown up and been trained, and we talk in terms of generational poor, not being able to get out of poverty, the poor family, the working poor, living paycheck to paycheck, and impoverished communities. And COVID-19 has certainly shown us as well how vulnerable large segments of our communities are during this time. In Canada, some short-term solutions have been put in place, and the federal government put in a CERB program who gave a large segment of workers whose jobs disappeared or had COVID-19 or were caregivers of ill relatives quick access to cash, but that's going to end soon. Our forms of special short-term relief were made, and they went to landlords, businesses, etc. However, we're still thinking in terms of what about second waves, third waves? What about other types of crises that can occur besides pandemics? We also started thinking now about what about lost opportunities that may never return for Canadians and communities and economically. And then we go back to our original thoughts on this topic. And then what about the estimated 1/3 of unemployed Canadians who are falling through the cracks of social programming and couldn't access any of these benefits? Canada is thought to have a strong social safety net, but we know that through neoliberal governments that's reduced the safety net, resulting in thin spots, as I call them, in that ice, and cracking, which is occurring. So we thought it's time to think again about long-term and strategic socioeconomic solutions, such as guaranteed income. The Canadian Association of Social Workers has been supporting this for quite some time, and we've published a position paper, and we call it UBIG. And when we say UBIG, we mean Universal Basic Income Guarantee. And a lot of people have said to me, do we really need that? I mean, in Canada, we have lots of benefits. We have the child benefit, guaranteed income supplements, old age securities. But when you think about it, in 2016 in Canada, we had 12.9% of our population, or 4 million people, were living in poverty. The child poverty rates have increased from 15.8% in 1989 to 19% in 2013. And we know that Indigenous children, children of color, and children of refugees are at a much higher risk for living in poverty. We recognize as well that, however, that the root causes of poverty are multiple, they're complex issues, and they all have intersecting layers. So there's not an easy solution. However, we think universal basic guaranteed income does a lot of good. And what it is really is proposing a basic income guarantee in the form of a universal tax-free demo grant. It's available to everyone, regardless of income. It moves us from the notion of Social Security being a social safety net to that of an equitable base for people. Universal programs remove eligibility criteria and reduce operating costs. And when you look at comparisons, you can really see the savings there. For example, in Canada, everybody at the age of 65 qualifies for old age security. Doesn't matter how much income you make. That program has an operating cost of 0.3% of the total program. However, unemployment insurance, which if you ask any Canadian will tell you are many hoops you have to jump through to get it, their program operating costs are 8.1% of the total program. So quite a huge difference. And available funds you could move into other programming. The guaranteed income also means, however, that people are still able to work. And what we're seeing across the country is a lot of new positions that are coming open or available positions are part-time, reduced hours. They're not full-time. And for a lot of people in the country as well, they're seasonal work. Canada has a lot of seasonal workers, be it farming, fishing, tourism, right? So this gives them an opportunity to work. It doesn't replace other social programming because we're not going to get rid of other social programming because that's important as well. So we will still have universal health care, unemployment insurance, assistance for newcomers coming to Canada, etc., just to name a few. But what a universal basic income does do, it gives people dignity. It gives them fiscal stability, stigma reduction, because there's poverty and the stigma attached to that is still strong. It also ultimately gives them better physical and mental health. And we believe that it results in a sustainable development and investment in people. And we think that's critical. And as social workers, we believe those are good things and ones that we should strive for and work for people and their communities that we have in this country and our region. Thank you.
Okay, Kat, thank you so much, Jen. You gave us a lot to think about. Again, I will ask people to think about these large issues and put it on the chat. And we're going to go over to Kathy.
Thank you, Mitt. My issue has to do with the longstanding institutional racism in law enforcement, and that it is truly a moment for social work. And in terms of pillar, relates to ensuring the dignity and worth of the person. I think everyone would agree that the video of George Floyd's death at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis triggered protests, not just in the US, but around the world on behalf of Black Lives Matter. In the US, I can tell you for sure, it brought renewed attention to the high-profile deaths of Black Americans during the past decade and drew much more attention to ongoing concerns about systemic racism in the criminal justice system. The police response in some of our American cities further fueled protesters and led to calls to defund the police. In fact, protests across the world have demanded that police treat people who are Black more fairly and end the other pandemic of unarmed Black people dying while in police custody. Floyd's death, caused by a police officer in the midst of a pandemic, which, by the way, has been disproportionately affecting Black people, has really starkly highlighted longstanding racial inequities in the United States and in every aspect of American life, is really forcing deep reflection and accountability across our society. And we are seeing from corporations pledging to combat systemic racism to cities seeking to eliminate police departments or reduce and reallocate funds to human services that are far better equipped to address the social issues that police are often called into. But protests are not enough. It's only the beginning. If we're going to really get anywhere, we're going to need legislation that supports our ability, social workers and others, to do the work that needs to be done to eradicate racism in policing. So that brings me to the macro focus needed, the advocacy for legislation, and trying to obtain that legislative framework, that policy framework that allows for more equitable practice. The National Association of Social Work is on record with a statement made just a couple of days ago as we've worked through this. And this is a moment by moment kind of developing issue. The statement seeks to dismantle racist policing. And of course, policy advocacy is a central activity for the National Association of Social Workers. And to that end, NASW has supported and applauded the US House of Representatives for passing the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2020. It happened in late June, and this legislation, I'm proud to say, was introduced by a social worker, Representative Karen Bass of California, who also chairs the Congressional Black Caucus. It will also be critical for the Senate to develop and pass similar legislation if we are meaningfully to reform and dismantle structural inequality that's been born of longstanding discrimination and white supremacy. But even if we don't get a Senate bill passed, state and local governments, are beginning to take some legislative initiative in this area. If the legislation is successfully passed, communities will have the support that they need to help local law enforcement make what we would consider real change, which usually happens at the local level, by the way. In the words of NASW Chief Executive Officer Angelo McClain, racism is real, must be eliminated. Police brutality is real and must be eliminated. Oppressive policing is real and must be eliminated. And we stand against oppressive policing. So what is the on-the-ground reality? Social workers, frankly, are already working alongside and in partnership with police departments across the nation. I have to wonder, frankly, what it would be like in many of those communities if those social workers weren't there to address the many social issues that police encounter in their role as first responders. Imagine what it would be like if we could be more intentionally across the country and perhaps the world with integrating social workers into the public safety landscape. If we had real policy frameworks that supported the role of social workers, if social workers were playing a key role in their communities across the country in creating a more equitable, less potentially lethal version of public safety. As previously stated, many communities already have social workers playing integral roles in police forces. Strengthening partnerships has demonstrated potential to be an effective strategy to address behavioral health, mental health, substance use, homelessness, family disputes, and similar other types of calls. With social work training and our value base, social workers can help police do their work much more effectively and humanely and help them become more attuned to cultural and racial biases. As policy researcher Michael Sheridan from the Brown School at Washington University's Center for Social Development has said, we're struggling to redefine how we organize public order, safety, and justice. But through this struggle is the opportunity for positive change. And he offers what might be possible from a social work perspective. First, he does so by unpacking what defund police might mean. From his perspective, it means to redefine and reshape community responsibilities with appropriate funding. There is acknowledgement that policing is needed to respond to major crime and violence, and few would deny that. Interestingly, at least in this country, it's been determined only about 20% of what police do actually relates to real crime. There is acknowledgement that policing in the US is racially violent, and it's a reality that we've had for a long time. There's a long history. We need to also face that policing is difficult to reform here. Departments have many resources and a lot of power and racist support, frankly, from the general public. Police unions are very strong and resistant to reform efforts. But with strong policies in place through that legislation, we have an opportunity to make change. Some considerations I'd like to leave you with. One, we should not ask our police to respond and do everything. We must consider the cost of over-policing, what comes of it, more physical harm, death, filling jails and prisons. Over-policing also poses a barrier to stronger communities and stronger countries. Social workers work among the people. They're in the community. They bring values that emphasize full inclusion and social justice. And as Silvana Martinez said in her welcome remarks, social workers are the everyday professionals. We're out there, we're with the people. So some potential strategies put forward by Sheridan and others would be, one, to shift all nonviolent community issues out of the authority of police departments and into a department for solving community social problems. Second, social workers should continue to partner with police in responding to calls in which social issues and violence intersect. That thirdly, social workers can help to reduce unnecessary violence through training and changes in culture of policing. And four, one that I thought would fit here very well would be to expand efforts to use restorative justice. So to conclude, I would just say, just as we seek a leading role as social workers in public safety, the profession of social work itself must also be very reflective about racism we may have within our ranks and in the systems we work within and create. We are not without fault, but we are work in progress. So we must always be vigilant about what we're teaching in our programs and seeking to ensure that we are actively anti-racist. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. You've given us a lot to think about, that social workers need to be at the table, not only at the micro level or the meso level, but also at the macro level. And that's in all places. So we really do hope we get some feedback from those who are listening about your comments. I will then move to Jan, we call her Jan, and ask her to address climate change.
Thank you very much, Mitt, and welcome everybody. As a North American, a settler on Treaty 1 land, I want to acknowledge that I'm living on Treaty 1 land, the land of the, also the land of the Métis and the land of non-status Indigenous people. This is important because we're living in a land as guests, really. And one of the things that we are being encouraged to do as Canadians is think about the kind of guests we are. And that sort of framed my thoughts on climate. Many of us in North America are economic and climate migrants. My grandparents, one set from Iceland, were climate migrants. They left because of volcanic disruption, crop failure, and other weather events that made living extremely difficult. Moved to North America, settled in an area that is not unlike, in the middle of Canada, not unlike Iceland, and also sometimes it has harsh weather too. But my point is that climate was a deciding factor in why so many Icelanders left at that particular point in the late 19th century. This continues today with many people moving either long distances or shorter distances to seeking an area of climate where they can survive, where they can care for their families and either find employment or continue in a resource industry. So what's different now, rather than the climate events of the 18th and 19th centuries that triggered migration, is that many of these now are caused by our impact on the environment. There are still fires and floods and drought compelling people to move either short or long distances, but the world now is warming. The effects are visible to affected residents anywhere in the world. Summers are hotter and either wetter or drier. Winters are harsher or milder with, again, an increase or a decrease in precipitation. This may not sound like much, but on a world scale it is. People are experiencing extremes that we are sure is related to the increase in global climate. This is arguably the most significant problem facing the world today. This is something that we need to get right because we are unlikely to get a second chance. Human activity from the mid-20th century onward is the most significant contributor to global warming. In Canada, this is particularly notable in northern communities, predominantly Indigenous communities, where the livelihood and mental health of Indigenous people have been impacted to the extent that it requires a targeted investment in the social determinants of health. As Canadians, we are aware of these changes, that there are plants growing in the extreme north that have never been seen there before. There are insects there that have never been seen there before. There are birds arriving in northern communities that have never been seen there before. And as a resident of Manitoba, where we have or had a significant polar bear population, we know that this is changing as well. Now we have these events such as triggered wildfires in Australia and the subsequent loss of wildlife and human life. Venice having severe flooding and the area around Jakarta experienced the same. Everything is more hurricanes, more tornadoes, more tropical storms, more island states, not only facing the rising seas, but also increased severe weather events. These are signs of climate emergency. We know this, and we need to act. The world has benefited in the past from the climate moderating effect of the Amazon rainforest. However, countries in that area have decided to try and maximize the economic output of the rainforest. And this is done through mining and agriculture in the area, from displacing Indigenous people, and from either deforesting or burning off trees in the forest. The Indigenous peoples who lived in the rainforest, as is true with the Indigenous peoples in North America, tread lightly on the land. They didn't leave behind devastation. They didn't contribute to climate devastation. And this is generally true of Indigenous peoples across the world. So the intersection of social work and climate change is obvious. Advocating for change to reduce harm and create a more just world is where our profession acts. We have to sort out for ourselves the actions and the activities that we will promote as a profession, and where we will be able to assist the wider population in in identifying goals and acting toward those goals. I've done some reading actually through the Canadian Association of Social Workers website, and we've had a couple of people who've spoken on climate change. One researcher believes that we will need to make a foundational change in our values as social workers. The other social worker says we can play a significant role in alleviating eco-distress, climate distress, and helping people focus on change as opposed to becoming distressed and inactive because of their reaction. We can emphasize community participation. We can listen, we can help, we can work to relieve distress. And we can also look at broadening a social narrative that supports listeners and helpers. Climate change impacts the quality of the food we grow and eat, the water we use. Livestock are impacted as it impacts their food, their nutritional content, and availability of safe water. Industrialized nations have offloaded the costs of globalization and international trade onto poorer nations, and outsourcing our pollution and degradation of the environment onto others. In a real sense, our assignment of consumption patterns should include the costs, real costs, of our exports and imports. So addressing these social and economic inequalities needs to be assigned first to developed countries to make changes in consumption and emission. So this includes the rights of Indigenous people to live on their land with environmental protection and lack of interference. And as social workers, we have an ethical duty to address social inequality in calling for climate change. And this is a critical first step. And just to continue briefly, one of the things we saw from COVID in the middle of all the crises and all the tragedy is that when we are less involved with the environment, it looks better. Water clears. Animals start walking down the streets in northern Scottish villages. Birds, I've heard more birds this summer than I have in the years I've lived in a heavily forested neighborhood. So our impact has, I hope, been brought home to people by noticing things they probably haven't seen in decades. But this offers hope that making these changes will benefit all of us, reduce stress for all of us while reducing stress on our planet. It also says we need to be thoughtful. Does it make sense to import small bottles of pickle relish from one country on the other side of the world to North America? In North America, we have the ability to grow the ingredients for pickle relish and to package it and to sell it. Is this the best thing for the exporting country? And the company that is making the pickle relish and transporting the pickle relish will not bear the environmental costs of doing this. This is a tiny example, probably a not very important one, but it's beginning small and growing bigger. Are we asking other countries to grow things for us that we could grow for ourselves? And as a result, they are not able to financially care for their own food needs. So another thought, we need to model a culture and a life that's less focused on acquiring and disposing of items. Particularly, I'm thinking of clothing, because now clothing can come very cheaply through countries on the other side of the world. And yet, what does this do for them? The reality is that there are women sewing these garments for a fraction of what garment workers used to be paid in Canada, which wasn't a lot, but it was a living wage. So we need to think about what we're doing, how it's impacting other people, how it's impacting us, because being over consumers does not end well for us either. So I'm asking that we consider as a profession that we need to be leaders in this. We need to start the dialogue. We need to encourage the dialogue. We need to help reduce the stress, and we need to take care of ourselves, because this is going to be a long road. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. You've given us a lot to think about. And we will obviously, I'll circle back to you with a couple of questions that popped up. we're going to move with Robin. And Robin, we are in the US is probably the country that's at the bottom with COVID, and the mental health stress that people are feeling, the issue of having to think about even returning your children to school and signing these death pledges that if they die, you can't sue. Our world is on the brink, and we definitely have to look at the social determinants of health, because everything that everyone addressed on this panel segues into that issue. So I don't want to put more pressure on you, but I do want us to understand that health is critical to all of these conversations. So I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Mitt. I'm really pleased to be with all of you today and be part of this North American panel region panel. And I have to say, this has just been a wonderful week with IFSW and this conference. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the social determinants of health, which is a concept I'm sure you're all familiar with. And it's one that aligned with the last global agenda and one that we might consider for the next one as well. The social, economic, and physical environment in which a person lives is widely recognized as influencing their overall health and well-being. And we've heard that just right now from our speakers here. Social determinants of health are the non-medical factors that impact your ultimate health as a person. And it's estimated that as much as 80% of a person's health is determined by the social and economic conditions of their homes and their communities. Social determinants of health, such as poverty, unequal access to healthcare, lack of education, stigma, and racism, are contributing factors to health inequities that we see amongst people and amongst groups. Healthy People 2020, which is part of the US Department of Health and Human Services, organizes the social determinants of health around 5 key domains: economic stability, education, health and healthcare, neighborhood and built environment, and social and community context. These 5 domains are also very important due to the global pandemic we find ourselves in. And yes, Mitt, if we've heard anything in this conference over the last 4 days, it's been the impact of COVID-19 and all the consequences the pandemic has brought to all of us in our countries as social work professionals, as well as what kind of an impact it's had for our clients and our communities. In the African region panel on the global agenda, several of the panelists spoke about the impact of COVID and the need to have social work more recognized as a profession, and how important interdisciplinary work with other professions has been during this pandemic. The speakers in the Asia Pacific region all spoke about the impact and effects of COVID-19 and the need to revitalize our profession. Professor Tan suggested that we need to be disruptors so that we can drive social change, get rid of our dysfunctional practices, theories, and move towards innovation. And certainly my colleagues here on this panel have spoke about the need to think out of the box, to think about things differently, and to really contemplate what we've all been going through and how to change things. The panel this morning on the ethical challenges to social work during COVID-19 again emphasized that social work is still unrecognized as a profession in many countries, and that there's an absolute need for us to be part of interdisciplinary teams, to cooperate and coordinate services with other professions. When Kathy talked about defunding the police and looking at police reform, there's certainly a way for us to be involved in that, and we have been. And another opportunity, again, as we've mentioned, to think about how we organize, how we educate, and what we do as social workers. I think the thing that's been most poignant for all of us, though, is that every speaker who's talked about COVID-19 has talked about the visual health disparities that we are actually seeing that exist in every country based on poverty, racism, and structural oppression. We know that generally members of minority and indigenous populations are disproportionately likely to have lower socioeconomic status, and they're more likely to have most undesirable health outcomes. There's absolute connections between racial disparities and upstream forces, such as economic inequality, which carry widespread social consequences. Unemployment, food insecurity, and unstable or unstandard housing conditions can further perpetuate disparities in health outcomes for people infected by coronavirus, as well as infected by other long-term healthcare issues. And they most specifically happen around communities of color, low-income communities of color. The pandemic has showed all of us the health disparities in who's getting access to healthcare, who's getting access to testing, who's successfully isolating. Certainly the people who have better income, larger homes, a better environment are successfully isolating better than those who are in cramped, overcrowded, poor conditions. And we're seeing the disparities between who's getting sick and then, of course, who's dying. As I've listened to my social work colleagues this week, and as we contemplate what the next global agenda needs for the next 10 years, there are certainly several themes that keep repeating, and I think we've all said them again and again, even in just this presentation. So I hope we can think about these and locate them in the global agenda for the next 10 years. And I'm also excited to hear your questions and your comments as we think about how we take the global agenda now into the future and where we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. This was an excellent hearing and kickoff to a lot of the issues and how we will address the next global agenda. One thing that I saw that came through very clearly is leadership matters. Who leads really matters, and social workers are leaders in their community. And community engagement matters, because far too often people develop plans and ideas without actually going to the grassroots and talking with the people. And that's what we do as social workers. We bring in that voice, and then we are advocates. We actually push for things for change. So it's with that thought that I would like for us to begin our conversations and how they related to each other. But first, I would like to ask any of you if you have a question to one another that you think is pertinent as we begin to make this connection. We talked about defunding the police and racial injustice that has existed in the US since the time that people of color have arrived, and even before that with indigenous people. And you've talked about, Jan, of how your people came from Iceland and set up, and how our environments actually relate to our own health. Where people live and the toxics that are released in the air. I know for me, when I visited Bangladesh, I happened to go to a factory that they were making jeans, and they were cutting holes in these jeans. And I watched young kids cut holes in jeans for people in the United States to wear. I refuse, and I would not allow any of my children to purchase jeans that had holes in them, because I wanted them to understand these were kids who had to strip down to their underwear and take razors and cut these holes into jeans to be shipped to the US. We need to, and social workers need to, take the voices of people in our communities and rise them. And then the living wage, the guaranteed income. Why is it that with all this wealth in our world, that we still want to have people who are poor? And we build ourselves on this pyramid, and it's a control issue, and it goes back to policing. So these are so many things that the global agenda could address, but I just want to make sure, as we wait for some chat questions to come in, to give you all an opportunity to just even ask one another a question. Robin, would you want to start?
Sure. I think what was fascinating for me as I sat here and listened to all of your presentations was that they're also interconnected with health. And that, you know, they're also interconnected with the disparities that we see in communities. And, you know, I think you all made the point that, and so many people this week have made the point that this is an opportunity for us. This is a time for us to really take a look at every single thing we do and say, why do we do it that way? Is there another way? Can we have other conversation? Are there people missing from the conversation? And I've heard too many times that we're missing from the conversation, you know, in many, many countries. And so I think also strengthening our profession is one of the key things we also have to continue to work on in this next global agenda.
I have a question for Robin and for Mitt. I know we have the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report, you know, in the United States, that's a very prestigious institution that do consensual reports and take deep dives. They did it and wrote a report integrating social needs care into the delivery of healthcare to improve the nation's health. And I guess from your perspectives, how can we better use that? I'm afraid what happened with the COVID coming, just as this was really getting launched and disseminated, how are we going to bring that back online? That's amazing work that really talks and amplifies everything you talked about, Robin. Any thoughts?
It was amazing work. It was amazing work, and it's an excellent report for people to look at. And I think it falls back on us again to promote it, right? And to make sure that we're seeing it in all areas, in practice, in education, overall. You know, I think one of the things that at NASW that we've worked on is trying to translate the global agenda to the regular social worker. Right. Yeah. And how do we bring that down to everybody in the workforce, in the social work workforce? And again, it's the same thing with this report. How do we take this and really drill it down so that people understand how important it is and how important they are? And then where do we make change from there?
Yeah, good.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I do know that I am working on a paper with actually Angelo McLean is on that paper as well. And one of the areas from that report that's going to be addressed is how to help healthcare workers be more inclusive and to deal with, as we talked about, looking at our own profession, looking at racism within the healthcare profession. You know, how does one get service? And if a person is different due to the color of their skin, how are they engaged? And what are some of the implicit and explicit biases that come in? So I do know that they're working on partializing a lot of that report and bringing out more papers to actually promote. So it is a piece of work that cannot be on a shelf. It has to actually be actualized. And I know that there's an effort to kind of do so, but and to also share with the world. I mean, this is how we are all interconnected. I again will, you know, listen to Angelo yesterday talk about the role of being transformative leaders, you know, where we bring in an inclusive model and we bring in our ideas and our opinions and strengthen the work of social work rather than becoming transactional and use it from the hierarchy. And just because who you are determines on who we kind of listen to. So I think that that's really important. Robin, there is a question that someone wanted to know. They wanted to know your thoughts about reframing the concept of social determinants of health using social factors of health. You know, how do we have the determinants seem fixed? They seem to be in place, but how do we take things and make them move? You know, just like we're talking about right now, mental health. You know, how do we kind of move that? Okay.
You know, calling it social factors of health I think is also very helpful. It's true, determinants are fixed in many ways. And if we look at what they list as the social determinants, we could have all probably guessed what they would be, right? And so maybe looking at social factors would be another way to do that. I think coming back to where we've been in the last few months under COVID, and maybe it's repeating and sounds like a dead horse to continue to say this, but it's the opportunity to say maybe that's not the best word. Maybe factors is better, right? Because then we may be bringing in other things that we hadn't thought about. The environment is certainly one thing that is definitely a social factor or social determinant of health. And there are implications, as Jan said, to levels of environment, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's where we begin to think about the factors as delineating all the components of those determinants and where we can go with them. Just a thought.
Question that came in that each of you can take time to address is, age demographics, and sometimes we kind of move into questions related to how do social work professionals who are young get involved in this movement? They want their place at the table, and rightfully so. We had a icon die last night, Representative John Lewis, but his work started when he was 18, 19, 21 years of age till the day that he died of 80. And so how do we make sure that we allow everyone's place at the table? Because we have to all people have to shape our future. I don't know about you, but I'm hoping young people take over so that I can have my rocking chair and sit back one day. So I'd like all of you to kind of address how we are inclusive, or how can we be better inclusive as social work associations? Good. Jan.
Oh, sorry, I think Joan wanted to speak.
No, you go ahead first.
Oh, basically agreeing with you, yes. And I was also looking at the implicit bias of some of the climate issues and the and hoping that we can work with younger social workers to have them pair, to understand that there's a push and pull on this, that just as it's difficult for older people to use public transportation if it's not accessible, particularly when you live in Winnipeg and it's -30 in the winter and +30 in the summer, which for my American colleagues is very cold and very hot. It's also the same for people with small children. It's not easy to take a bus in very cold weather or very hot weather and manage everything that goes. So we need to, as younger and older social workers, listen to each other. We all have things to add, and particularly to hear that we have points in common, but there are maybe significant differences in how younger social workers view the action that they can take to help heal the world. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll just add on to what Jan is saying. I think there's a couple of things. When I started my career in social work, there was no association in the province in which I lived, right? So you didn't have to be registered or anything else. And that's evolved and changed. So now we have control over title and practice of social work, which is really amazing. But what I tell students that I had all the time was this, is that when you start in practice, you have to find yourself a mentor. You have to work with somebody. But that also means social workers who are out there, who are in the midpoint of their career and the end point of their career, have to make themselves available to support, to listen, to encourage other social workers. I think sometimes we don't do a really good job of that. And because life is busy, and I understand that, but part of feeling that you have a voice at the table is feeling that someone is listening to you. So if your peer is not listening to you, sometimes you feel you don't have a voice. And it's really important. I say to young social workers all the time, you need to get involved in something, right? Find a cause you're passionate about and get involved, because that's what's going to sustain you. This is a hard career. It's a challenging career you've chosen for yourself. And, people who do social work don't do it because they want a fun job. I mean, this is a job where we get stuff thrown at us every single day. People's lives are complicated. And, usually in every place I've ever worked, people have said, get the social worker to deal with this. I don't want to deal with this. You get the social worker. So we have to be supportive of each other. We have to be, and I'm going to say this, we have to respect each other. We have to be kind to each other. Because if you're having a hard day, you need to be able to feel that you're able to talk about that and to figure out what's the next step for me in helping these people. It is demanding work. One of the things that was just mentioned was about the wonderful things that we've heard through this conference. And I heard two things that really stood out for me, I think. One was when Amy Best spoke, and she talked about social work is a human rights and social justice profession, no matter what your area of practice is. And that grounding for me was like really critical because it made me stop and think. And as social workers, we need to figure out how we incorporate that into our practice. And I think that starts from day one, and it evolves and changes, but it starts at day one. The other thing I heard from Victor Paul when he spoke about his work in India was, what is your legacy? What do you want your legacy to be, right? Because sometimes I think when we're dealing with systems, and I call them hoops and challenges you got to jump through sometimes to get to advocate for your clients, you kind of get lost sometimes in like, this is the task I have to deal with. But for us, what do you want your work to be? Where do you want that to go? How do you want to help people? Those are some of the things you have to sit and you have to think about, because you do make an impact in people and their lives and their families and their communities. And I think sometimes we don't realize that because it is busy, it's hectic work and it's demanding. And yes, there are people out there who will never understand what it is you do. So you got to tell them. That's my thought.
Kathy, you go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Robin. What you are saying makes me think about an article I read shortly after Mr. Floyd died. And it was written by Barack Obama. It was called How to Make This Moment the Turning Point for Change, for Real Change. And it makes me think of young people right now who have been heavily involved in protest. They feel passionately about this. They are very idealistic. And, our young social workers, obviously want to make a difference. So for me, it's often the question of how do you nurture that zeal and idealism and energy, nurture it, but also help them channel it into the advocacy and policy making that needs to happen to create those frameworks where the real change happens. Raising the issue and protesting and hitting the streets, very important. Bringing it to everyone's attention, but giving them the support to keep that alive, but also help them move to the next step. Lace up the sneakers, go out, get people registered to vote, get to know who your legislators are wherever you may live in the world, and how to start talking to them and making a difference and learning how to hold elected officials accountable. Because as Amy said, and I was impressed by her statement too, I mean, no matter where we sit or stand, we are working for human rights and what's fair and so on. So that's what I would add to what we could do for our younger social workers.
And Robin?
Oh, I think Kathy covered it. Between
Okay.
Kathy and Joan, that was a good question.
Right. What I would like to say to young people who are new to the profession is, you don't have to wait to be invited. You have a place at the table. We are colleagues. There's no age of when you become a colleague. It is when you get your degree in social work. You have the opportunity to speak up. I encourage people to join the associations, to run for positions, to serve on task forces, to take your ideas. That's how I got started. No one ever called me up and said, you want to come along. And I learned that from my education. And I think that someone hit on that. we were expected as graduate of Central State and Howard University to be at the table. And our professors demanded that we go into the community or go to the Hill and sit there, and not just when we see social injustice, to address it. And it is a climb, but you'll be surprised how much you will be welcomed. So I invite all of you, this is a plug, to join your association and to be an active member and to serve on committees. And, you know, I laugh because oftentimes we want social workers to get out and get other people to vote, but sometimes we struggle to find people to fill the positions that we have. We should have more people, a plethora of people running for positions than we do. So I just want to take this time to say, you're invited, but you have a right to be there. You are our colleagues. Now, there's one thing that I wanted to kind of talk about, or someone was, you know, get this sustainability, you know, the things that we choose to sustain, our values, can sometimes often result in social inequality, because as we look at things, you know, we tend to try to do things the same way. And you know, why this movement that has occurred in our society right now is so fascinating to me, because that's, to me, is only when the world listens. And we have this window of opportunity, social work, to put our imprint on this time. Because I'm a systems theory, it's going to swing back. And I think what we need to make sure is, where do we make the adjustment? So I would like us to kind of look at and take the movement that's occurring throughout our world, not just in the US, but throughout our world. There's movements occurring. How does social work take a voice, take our leadership role, and make sure we're represented? And so I asked anyone.
Mitt, I think one thing that I've noticed is that even we as social workers are taking an issue, examining it, moving on. And as a second wave feminist, I'm sometimes very discouraged that the changes didn't stick and the attitudes didn't change. And I think that certainly, I've heard the same comment about the 60s. They were so hopeful. It really looked like things were going to change. And then we see something else, or, you know, the media picks up a shinier toy, and we don't stick it out. And I guess it's hard to stick out with stuff that isn't new and exciting and may be incremental. But as a profession, we know that incremental change can be, it can be transformed into change on a larger scale. But we need to look at going back to some of those changes to bring about equality for women, for people of color, for Black people, and really revisit, reuse what worked and what might work again, and look for new ways as well. Because the world is not equal for women, for people of color. And we know that. We look at globalization and realize that the world is not equal for everyone, and the wealthy have set it up to work well for them and not for anyone else.
And you know, I will add to that. The one thing that social work does not do is market itself very well. And I just happened last night, a woman who I met years ago, who's now is mayor, Christy Chastity Wells Armstrong, and I just connected her with Martha Guerrera, who's running for mayor in West Sacramento, and then there's Tracy Mims, who's the mayor in Mississippi. You know, I started to look at the fact that there has been some change, and these are all social workers, by the way. These are all social workers who are running for office, winning those offices, young people making a difference, and yet we don't promote it as much as we should. And so in pushing this global agenda, how do we make sure that we're not always coming from the deficit model, where we haven't done anything, and kind of promote the non-deficit model of the achievements that we have made. And I think, Kathy, you were talking about that as we're looking at the report. We tend to move on and not take the opportunity to say, where are we in social work? And I know that that's happening globally. So how would you promote, as we look at the global agenda, this vision for the next 10 years, that as we do all of this hard work, we make sure we promote it in places so that people understand and we document the changes that we're making? How would you suggest, or do you think that's important?
I think it is important, and I think we have lots of ways to, channel it out there. I happen to know Chastity because she's from my state, just up the road about 100 miles. We could showcase people who are social workers and elected officials. The Representative Karen Bass, a social worker in our US Congress who put forth the effort to get a major piece of legislation passed. That's something we could certainly put, through our NASW, but also for IFSW. We have, every region has a page. And when we come across these great happenings of new elected officials who happen to be social workers, we can send those in as news items and profiles of these folks. So I guess the other thing in terms of marketing, there's something each and every one of us can do, and that is to claim our professional identity as social workers. Far too often people take up positions which, use their skills heavily, but there's some kind of BP of this or that, but how's come we can't include that social work piece there? And because we're bringing value added to whatever it is that we participate in. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Yes, I when I first got on, I had to vote. A member of IFSW had to resign because they were Secretary of State. That is a worthy thing. Do you want to speak to that, Jan or Kathy? You work with the person, and I think that that's something that people need to hear.
I think there are some countries that do esteem social work much more than maybe some other countries. And so Jan and I had the opportunity to work with Anna Lima. And remember? Yeah, so that is quite something.
Yes, we don't see it as a loss when one of us succeeds in politics, because you bring the message along with you. And I know that Wendy Sherman will acknowledge her beginning in social work and how this has formed some of her attitudes. And I was listening to her on the news last night talking about politics and about making change. And I thought, I'm hearing a social worker. It was really evident in the way she was approaching the problem. So yes, you're right. We need to be out there, be known.
Yeah. And I think too, Jan, we've talked a little bit about this as well, that it's the opportunities. Like the other day I was listening to the news and Senator Bernard was on being interviewed on national news, right? Or whatever. And at the end of it, the commenter said, and imagine she's a social worker, right? And someone else was in the room, they said, is she a social worker? And I said, yeah, absolutely social worker. So when we see those opportunities, right, we have to promote that. And I even say to, the younger students that we have and that, or young social workers, is exactly that, is that you have to promote yourself. It's like when they go for interviews for their practicums, and I would be there, you really have to shine a light on you. And they're like, I'm not very comfortable doing that, right? Tell me what you did in your last, placement, your last practicum or whatever. Oh, well, it wasn't that important. And I'm like, stop right now, right? We have to talk about this. What you did was really important, right? And it's that almost switch that has to be turned on to make people feel okay to talk about the importance of the work that we do. And we're not comfortable with that.
just gave me an idea. I mean, I think IFSW could promote social workers from around the globe, that when something related to the climate or an incident happens, that we can give to the newscaster a list of social workers so we could speak for it. I often get so frustrated that someone else will talk about what's going on with the community when we're at the community. We're there when the crisis occurs and long after. So that might be a way that IFSW can take a position. Let me kind of play and reverse roles on it for a minute. As we're looking at the vision, and Robin, I'm going to ask this to you for the social work profession for the next 10 years. If I were a member of the community that you were serving, I would say to you, how does social work help me? And here I have a mental, let me say that I have a child who is in need of mental health services. I don't have a guaranteed wage. I have to catch 3 buses to get them to their therapist. And so therefore I just don't go, because I just, the maze is too deep. How would you help me advocate that how would you change the system?
That's a big question, Mitt. There's so much to change in what you just mentioned, and I think that gets to what we talk to students about and how we think about it. Social work education is, where do you we're finding the root cause of the problem first, if we can do that and identify that, and then figuring out from a systems theory perspective, and then what are all the components that person or that client is interacting with, where there's a breakdown in service or in accessing what they need as a person. And you could go into every single direction with it. And it highlights the micro, meso, macro functions of social work, because some of what you said, you would want to help them with direct services and help them get something specific. But other pieces of that are policy related, in terms of why are they in that situation, and what is this, their housing or their environment like, that they, that also has an impact on what's going on. And then, what do we look at in the community? So I think, there's so many different ways to look at it, and so many different tactics to take. And I think we have to make sure that we have people and students that are educated in all of those areas, and that want to go into all of those areas, and that we highlight the fact that we work in these various positions for people. That you can't tell that to a client. You just have to say to them, I'm going to try to advocate as much as I can for you, with you, for you to help me know what you want to do first, where you want to get to, and then we'll work together on that.
So let me bring a radical question to you in the Academy. Kathy, I will direct this, and Jen and Joan. We have social work placements, we have internships, and everyone does so many hours of their internship. Now, I don't often equate ourselves with the medical model, but I always find it interesting that there are some social workers who graduate from their schools of social work without any, and never working with the public sector. Always, and sometimes refusing to go into those type of placements. Should we have a rotation of placements that require all social workers to work in the public and as well as the private sector? Maybe, so many months here and so many months there, because if you don't really understand the situation, how do you address the question that you just had?
Can I jump in this one? Yes.
Sure.
I worked in child welfare, and I am a latecomer to social work, in that I got my first degree when I was in my late 30s, which was a benefit, because nobody really knew that I was a beginner. They all assumed that I knew what I was doing, so that helped a lot. One of my professors said, how many of you want to go into child welfare? And of course, not very many hands went up, and he said, guess what? Many of you will work in child welfare. And I think that working, as you say, Mitt, in those publicly funded or publicly delivered services, is a really good experience. Sometimes it clarifies for you that you don't really want to do it. Other times it helps you say, yes, I found the place where I can make a difference. Or I take a skill from one place and take it into another. One of my professors had marched at Selma. He'd been arrested under the War Measures Act, which he saw as a great acknowledgement of his political threat to the government of Canada. But he talked about you have to know when to approach the political system, and this is how you do it, and there's times and there's cycles. So it's those kinds of things that can be taught, or they can be relayed from more experienced social workers to younger social workers. So yeah, I think you're right. I think some experience with government services, even if you don't work there, you may be in a position one day to know where you poke it to make it work better for someone else.
Mm-hmm. Joan, I just want to add to what Jan said, because my last position, I was a field education coordinator. So I coordinated BSW and MSW placements at the university where I worked. Very challenging at times, because under our BSW program, students have to do 2 practicums. And we have a rule that students can't do 2 practicums in the same area. And I'd have people argue with me that I only want to do child welfare, or I only want to do health. Or my favorite answer of all time was, I only see my vision of me in the future is only working here. And I used to say to them, I want you to really start thinking about other things, right? For the same reason that Jan said, you may potentially wind up working in, a publicly funded area. And it's really important to have that exposure. I've had people who've said to me, I went there, I hated every minute. It just reinforced, I never want to do it. And I'd say, that's good for you and good for the clients. You're not going to be there. Great. And the flip has happened. There were people have said, I loved every single minute. I have so much respect for the team that I worked with. They're really trying their best to help. And I learned a lot, right? So those things are good. But that's why we always said to people, especially in the BSW program, because you really don't know what you're getting yourself into. Because sometimes students tell you things like, my mom thought it'd be a really great job. I can get a job doing that, right? So it's a good thing to do. And not having a full understanding of what's involved in social work. So we try to do in terms of diversity, but we also ask other social workers who are experienced from different fields, come in and talk about what it is you do. Yeah. And because some of them have no idea. And I think it's really important because, I started off my career thinking I was going to work in corrections. I never worked one day of 37 years in corrections. So, it just worked out that way. But we've done some other things. We've done split placements. So for example, we might have 6 weeks you're spending in an inpatient acute care mental health unit, but then you're going to spend the next 6 weeks following that client as they go into community mental health. So they get a different exposure. It's a problem. It's, dealing with, mental illness, but it's a different exposure to what services people do and how people work. So I think it's really important. And I'm going to give a plug for any social worker out there who sees this, that really, really make an effort to support students, because someone gave you an opportunity. Sure. And it's a real struggle at times to find good spots with good social workers.
Robin, let me just ask you this question because I didn't realize we were so many baccalaureate people. I mean, all of us taught in BSW programs. And I always find that BSW, and I will say that it is my own bias, are committed, passionate people. But I want to talk to you for a minute about the MSW, those that enter at that level that will say to you, it's all I really want to do is hang out my shingle and be a clinician. And please, I have no problems with clinicians. Please, I don't. But how do you handle that person in terms of getting them to understand the public sector or their duty as a social worker for pro bono work even?
That's a great question. And I think, I always like the BSW education as well. It's where I first got started. And it's everything in social work, right? The soup to nuts of social work is all in BSW education. And then when we get to the MSW, we have, at least in our region, specifically requested that people specialize in something. And so we shoot them into a line or a track. And many people want clinical. At Monmouth University, where I'm the dean, we have 2 concentrations, one in clinical practice with families and children, and one in global and community practice. So we'd have the macro, and the macro piece is always has fewer students than the clinical. But what all of us, and our program is based in human rights and social justice. So we're coming from that foundation for our whole program, undergraduate and graduate. And our faculty are very good about talking to students about the fact that you can't be clinical without knowing the community.
Right.
You can't be a good clinician without understanding policy. You have to know research and how to read it and how to know whether it's worthwhile or not. And so it's not just about getting to hang out the shingle, but you've got to understand all of these other pieces of who we are as social workers. And fortunately, you know, we also have students we require in their first year of the MSW, if they're coming in as 2 years, to do 500 hours in some place that they may not have thought of going into. And then the second year, you know, they concentrate. And we're continually just trying to bridge that gap, Mitt. And I think it's something that we're going to have to do all the time. It's something that's present all the time. It's not just one, it's everything. And we have to see that. And it's good to have a specialization, but you have to know all the other components.
I think as educators, we have to help give students the lenses to put on to help them, you know, understand that what they've had in a macro course is being played out. That's where it really comes together and they see it, and hopefully it clicks, because not to, you know, do some of the public agency kind of work is, I think you leave with an incomplete education in some respects if you have no experience at all with that. And that's really where our profession lives in terms of, you know, where we got started and who we were serving. So you leave without the full picture, I think, as a practitioner.
And I think that, you know, when we think about this, we're talking about this from our North American perspective. Yeah. And we have to acknowledge that there are social work programs in many other parts of the country and the world that start with the community. Mm-hmm. And their focus is far more on the community than we are in North America. And so, you know, that's something that we have to think about too, I think, in terms of looking at best practices in social work that come from all over the world, not just in our particular region.
I kind of see our work with police departments moving much more into the community if we can get that moving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you all are correct on all of that. I mean, I tend to think that, you know, visiting NGOs in, you know, Ghana has certainly given me a different perspective on how to carry out mental health than the analytic world that we have here in the US. And so it's important that we, and the beauty of IFSW is that we actually can talk and address all of the models and develop more of a worldwide view of what works, because people from all over the world live in each of our communities. It's not just isolated to the community. So the vision that you have, and we're going to spend the last few minutes just doing a round robin, so to speak. Everybody know what a round robin is? You just add your response to this question. So what is your vision for the social work profession for the next 10 years? Round robin starts, and we'll start with Robin.
I knew you were going to do that. I was getting unmuted. I think this next global agenda just needs to take us to the next level in terms of recognition as a profession and recognition worldwide of the benefits of having social work at every facet, at every level of work in every country. So I'll stop there.
Kathy, you're next.
I can only agree with what Robin said. You know, I envision a rising tide of caring. I mean, if we could really look at social determinants then maybe the community becomes the hospital that helps us, stay healthy and do better and flourish. So that's what I would hope for.
I'm thinking as well, adding to that social work as a profession is stronger, and that we strengthen our profession ourselves in terms of participating in social work training, education, supporting, all of those things. And at the same time, being able to say what it is we do and why and how we help.
Jan?
I'd like to see us work with societies, particularly those that are affluent, in destigmatizing providing equity in services to everyone. And I'm particularly thinking about healthcare. I find it confusing that we wouldn't all want universal healthcare. And Canada, as Joan knows, hasn't had it forever. And my parents told me about the impact it had on their lives as parents with 5 young children, one of whom was very ill at the time. So I struggle with understanding why we wouldn't want to provide health care for everyone to the extent that our society can afford it. And for societies that are struggling to do that, I think it's our job as social workers to do what we can to influence the situation. And I believe that social work still has work to do in ensuring that women are truly equal across the world.
Can't hear you.
That's happens. Tribe is doing. Before I wrap up, I'm going to ask you one question and ask everybody to just say one thing. And I'll start with you, Kathy, because Kathy and Janice were on the IF board before, so you have a good idea of what the themes. So what global agenda themes will help build that vision? What themes do you think we should have?
What themes?
What global themes? What are some of the themes? Before we started on pillars, the 4 pillars that we have, what do you think should be some of the themes that occur?
I'm not
Anybody
sure. I think we're going to have a model maybe that we could create that would be a process for countries and communities to go through to identify, what places they need to focus effort on, and to go through some kind of action planning process for how that's going to happen. So I'm kind of structural.
Okay. Janice?
I guess as a theme to focus on improving and sustaining the social factors or the social determinants of health for people across the world.
Okay. Joan?
I'm thinking about transformation at an individual and a societal level.
Okay. And Robin?
Yeah, I would say transformation and innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Well, I want to first thank all of you. This has been fun doing this, and yet very important work that we're doing. I don't want to minimize that. And I want to remind us and all of those that are listening is that we all are change agents. Social workers are change agents, that they examine what is in our institutions, and we advocate to bring change. That is our role, to better serve our society. We cannot institutionalize oppression and have the controls in place that do not allow the voice of the vulnerable to be heard. So I think as we look and we move towards the next global agenda, we definitely want everyone's voice at the table in terms of making sure that social work carries out the voice of the community. Community engagement is critical to everything we do. Or we oppress people by coming up with a model and not asking, is the model right for you? So as we begin to examine where we're going, we must also make sure that we do not dictate for people those things that may not be in the best interest of their community. I think social work kind of started off that way years ago when we go back and we look at even child welfare as what is in the best interest of the child, without really examining what is in the best interest of that family and how does that family want us to help. And so we disrupted families for what we call gross physical neglect, when in reality, we could have maybe put things in place to allow kids to stay at home. So it is important as we are in this movement that we always remember that the voice of the voiceless must be heard. And that is our role as social workers. And if we do that, we will have a global agenda for the next 10 years that is one that moves the community along to a better place. And that's really kind of my closing comments. I want to thank all of everyone who engaged with us to make sure that they write their comments as we consider the global agenda for 2020 to 2030. As we look back in 2030, to know that this panel laid the foundation of some of the recommendations that will come out. I also want to thank Sylvania for being the president of our association and doing such a marvelous job. It just showed to me that social workers can do anything. And also Rory and the executive and Lola and Pascal. And there's, you could just go on and on and on. And all of you, because this is something that's new to me, but you all helped me along. So thank you. I think that's the end.
Thank you.